Hi, and welcome to this video, which is part of your conference series. I'm Ard Louis, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the University of Oxford. I'm going to speak to you today about the calling of Christian postgraduate students and postdocs and academics, with a special focus on those in the sciences and engineering, but some of the ideas are, I think, much more widely applicable. First, a little bit about myself. So I'm a Professor of Theoretical Physics, and I work on a wide range of topics that are linked to statistical mechanics, broadly speaking. I also did some quantum theory in my earlier days, and I'm still interested in some of those problems. I've now moved into biophysics, so I do a series of things on self-assembly, how things make themselves. I'm interested in using physics to try to understand biological evolution, and that has actually led me more recently to working on machine learning, particularly deep learning, which uses neural networks, which is a very fascinating field and something very interesting and closely linked to physics and its techniques, although the applications are very different. And of course, I really do this together with a group of students and postdocs. And here you see a picture, actually a bit dated now, but of my group, which I put on my website, because for myself and my colleagues, it's really the quality of our students and our postdocs that's most critical to our success. And that means people like you who are watching this video, you're very important to us. In the humanities, students often work on their own, and the supervisor may pick something up from talking to them and learn something from them, but they don't publish together. But we publish together, we're a group. And so here you see my current group. I've got all the names listed here. And I recently was told to put all our alumni on. So we have my alumni, I think there's 70 alumni now that have come through my group, either master students or PhD students or postdocs or undergraduates that have all done some research project with me. And so one of the greatest joys of my work is being able to help these young people who are all very bright and very motivated and very interesting to talk to. I'm helping them on the next step of their career to go on and research. And of course, people like myself who are academics, we have kind of walked through the different echelons and made it to a kind of holy grail of academia, which is to have a permanent position. And the reason this is kind of a holy grail is because there's lots of people trying to get these positions. It's often more competitive than you might realize. And part of that is because these are really wonderful jobs. So I pinch myself sometimes that I get paid money to think about what I think is interesting. So I told you I started out in kind of quantum physics things, and now I moved on to evolution. That's because I'm paid money to think about what I think is interesting, and my interests have changed over time as I've been exposed to different kinds of problems. And there aren't that many jobs in this world where you are so free enough to really think about things on your own. It's a little bit like music or the arts or, say, sports, or there's a number of other professions where it's really also a passion for people. I remember when I was an undergraduate in the University of Utrecht that there were these old professors who were retired, some of them many years retired, in their 80s even, who still came in every day to work. And my grandfather retired around the same time, actually, I think my grandfather would have loved to have gone on in academia, but he was born in a different generation, had to leave home at 16 to support his brothers and sisters and his family, and so never really went on in education as much as he would have loved to, and worked a perfectly good, reasonable job in a company. But when he retired, it was like, now finally I can do what I really want to do. And here I was at the university watching these old retired professors who were absolutely delighted to come back into work every day. And it's because they loved what they were doing. And so there's a great privilege to be in academia. And I say that also because it's not a calling for everybody to go on academia in this way. And one of the dangers of being in academic group, particularly if you're starting out, is that you can start to have your own sense of identity formed by your mentors. And of course, I'm very enthusiastic about science. I can't imagine anything else more exciting to do. But if you look at my alumni, the students that come through my group, a number of them, a good number of them actually, have gone on to academic careers. But a lot of them have gone on to other kinds of careers in industry, in finance is one of the places that some of our students end up in. And each of those things are also good careers. So when I'm speaking to you today about being a Christian in academia, I think some of that should apply to this wider set of ideas as well, not just to the kind of academic career that I have been lucky to have. It's something that I really enjoy. And this, I'm not telling you this is something for you necessarily, but it may be. and it's something to keep worth thinking about. So I'm going to talk really about two different things. I should briefly say to you that I always like to put a little advert here for a film that I made not too long ago, a documentary series with an atheist friend of mine, David Malone, who's a very good filmmaker. And it's called Why Are We Here? And if you're interested in kind of big questions of science and faith, it's a good place to start. And if you've got friends who aren't Christians, it might be a good place to start as well, because David and I kind of bat back and forth the big questions of life. And we asked that little gratuitous advert. I'll tell you my outline. I really only have two main themes. One is, could academic pursuits be a godly vocation? And then I'm going to talk about odium theologicum, which I'll define later, and other pitfalls of being a Christian in the academy. So I want to start really with this piece of scripture, which is very important to me. And this piece is basically telling us all things. Is a Christological passage, so a passage about Christ. It's very famous from Colossians 1. You can see a kind of parallel passage in Hebrews 1. And Paul writes, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. This is a very beautiful little theological encapsulation of part of the gospel story. But the bit I want to highlight here is when it's talking about creation, it doesn't just say that all things were created by God, but by Christ. But he was before all things, obviously. God was there before, Christ was there before the earth began. But in him all things hold together. In another passage in Hebrews, will say that he sustains all things. And this is really important because it tells us that everything in this current world is held together by God. It's not just there for a random purpose. It's something that God wanted, something God desired, and something that God is currently involved in because he holds all things. One way to think about this is Christians sometimes imagine a kind of deistic God, which is a world that's working on its own, and every so often God pokes in. And in some traditions, you might say, well, God was very present today in the service because something special happened. And it's true, God is present. Maybe you could say we noticed God's presence, but God is always present because God is there in everything, whether we notice him there or not. And this is a super important passage for us to think about. It means that whatever we're doing, whether we're a butcher, a baker, or a candlestick maker in our work, or whether we're at home taking care of young people, younger children, or of elderly people, all those things are all ways that we are working in a world that was created by God and is held together by him. Another theme that I wanted to touch on briefly is the idea of God's pleasure in us. This is now an older movie. It's a very famous one, won an Oscar. It's called Chariots of Fire. It's about a runner called Eric Liddell, a Scottish runner, who was one of England's greatest sprinters and 400-meter runners. And the story is of his life. And part of one of the scenes, his sister comes to him. And it turns out Eric Liddell was actually wanted to be a missionary. In fact, he became a missionary to China and died in the end of the Second World War. Oh, sorry, he died at the end of the Cultural Revolution, when he was incarcerated there. And but at some point, his sister says to him, Eric, why are you doing all this running? Because I thought you wanted to be a missionary. And he says, well, I do. I believe God made me for a purpose, and that purpose is China. But he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure in me. And so one of the things that might be true for you if you're currently studying the sciences or engineering, you've come there because you've done well at school, because you have a talent for it. And it gives God pleasure to have us develop those talents, just like I believe it gave God pleasure to watch Eric Liddell run so fast in his day. And so I think that's a useful thing to think about, that we can do things that God has purposed us for, not just because they have some kind of utility, to the world in and of themselves, but because they gives God pleasure to watch us do things that we do well, the things that He's made us to do well. And this holds for a wide variety of aspects of our lives, of course. But you can think about this, it's helpful to think about this in our sciences. So, for example, when I finished my PhD, I went to the United States to do a PhD and did a lot of Christian ministry there, particularly with international students. And at the end of that time, was asked whether I'd considered to be the director of a very large international student ministry. And so that was very appealing to me at the time. And I talked to some friends and we discussed it. And, they said, well, you probably would be not too bad at running this thing, but you got to remember that you have also a special talent for physics. And you want to think about which of those talents you really want to use. And this film by Little and the idea of God having pleasure in me was an important factor in me staying on in academia. And I believe that was, in fact, what God called me to do, not least because they then hired somebody else to be the director of that organization, who I think in many ways, in almost every way, was vastly better than me at that job. So that was a good confirmation for me that I took the right path. So that's just an example of how God might be calling you. And I think one thing for you to think about in this series of talks that you're going to is, has God perhaps called you to the engineering that you do, or the science that you do, or the things that you do in your day-to-day life? So God has called you to life, I say here to Oxford, but it could be to Hong Kong, where we are, to Life of the Mind. And Life of the Mind may become a lifetime of vocation, as it is for me. Or you may be doing this outside of your professional job. You might be thinking, maybe you have a job that wouldn't take a huge amount of your intellectual capacity, but you can still develop your mind and think Christianly about all kinds of things. So why do we do academic pursuits for Christian? Because it gives God pleasure, because it serves humanity in the church. Obviously, if you're in the sciences or engineering, you can think of lots of potential applications that may have, and this can be really important. If you look on the Developing Christian Mind website, you'll see a very beautiful exposition by Donald Hay, where he expounds Jeremiah 27, which is about the Israelites in exile. And they are told to seek the welfare of the city, even when they're in exile, because when it prospers, they too will prosper. And so those are reasons to pursue to have academic pursuits. Another reason may simply be because this gives you access to reaching people for Christ that you wouldn't otherwise reach. And that's also a valid reason to be in the marketplace, because you'll have access to people, or maybe a platform that will allow you to speak to people in a way that you wouldn't otherwise. And all of these are valid reasons, and there are probably many more, of thinking about why you might be called to an academic career, either now as a student, when you definitely are called because that's where you are, or perhaps later in life if that is where God wants you to be. And I think it's really important that perhaps in your groups you spend some time thinking about this topic. Could you be called, are you called to where you are right now? Well, definitely yes. But what does that mean, and why has God called you, and what are the things that God is calling you to? And I think these principles should work for a wide range of things, not just sciences, but also for, if you're a bookkeeper or an accountant. I have a friend who was speaking to a series of accountants and asked them, who were Christians, and asked them, what does it mean for you to be a Christian accountant or a bookkeeper, really? So they were kind of lower end of the accounting world. And one of them said, well, as a Christian, I want to make sure that I'm honest and keep my books straight. Another one said, well, as a Christian, it means that I volunteer on the weekends with my church to help them balance their books. Another one said, I run a Bible study in my my company, and this is how I give my Christian duty. And what's interesting about those answers, all of which are good, is that none of the accountants, she said to me, well, actually, I'm honoring God by doing the accountancy, which is, of course, what they spend most of their day doing. And so there's something impoverished about a theology that says the only Christian part of your work is these extra bits, as important as they are. It's the actual accounting itself. It's the actual adding up those numbers and making sure that they work, which can be something that can be a true calling from God, given that that's what God's called you to do, and given that's also where you spend a lot of your time. And that obviously holds for the sciences too. So it's important that we don't just do these sciences or engineering because we think they have some kind of, we're going to solve, some great, solve the energy crisis or solve some other great thing that humanity needs, as important as that is. We're also doing that because this is what God has called us to do. That's a little thought on calling and why you are called. I think it's something that's well worth discussing further with your in your groups. So another thing to think about is, I want to talk to you when you're thinking about your academic pursuits, the godly vocation, is how might it feel to you right now when you are, say, a student. So let's say you're a postgraduate student particularly. Well, here's a circle of, say, what might be all academic knowledge, everything that we actually know at this point. And when you're in school, in elementary school, you all learn more or less the same thing, reading, writing, and arithmetic. In secondary school, you also learn more or less the same thing. And at university, you might specialize a little bit. You might go off into some specialized topic like engineering or science. And then if you keep studying, you'll get to the end of your undergraduate career and you'll have learned a lot about physics, for example, and you'll have learned this little bit of knowledge. And then you go to a postgraduate education, which is where you are here. And then what you realize is you're now at the edge of knowledge. And the big difference between being an undergraduate where you're consuming knowledge and being a postgraduate where you're supposed to produce knowledge is that the idea is that you push on this boundary, okay? You push and you push and you push and you push. And if you're lucky, you make a little bump like that. And that will be your DPhil or your MPhil or your PhD or your master's or whatever it's called in your institution. And that's a huge amount of work. And the reason I'm drawing it this way is because it often feels like this is what your whole world is about. The whole world is turned into this. You're pushing on this little line, and everything the world has become very small and very focused on that one little thing that you do. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with this. It's good to focus, but it can often feel like the whole world revolves around this certain thing, or your sense of who you are, your sense of well-being, completely links on this little tiny bit of the world. And it's important then to take a step back and remember that there's this big, wider thing out there. And perhaps the biggest thing you learn as a graduate student is that obtaining reliable knowledge is difficult. So often my students feel like, when they're doing their PhD, they need to do something great. And occasionally somebody will do something great as a PhD student, but often that isn't the case. They may do something great later, but really it's a training time. You're learning how to solve something. Inevitably, when I speak to younger students and ask them, what do you want to do? In physics, depending on which topic they're working on, they often have wildly over-ambitious ideas of what they're going to be able to achieve. And as they work on it, you have this big wide idea and you narrow it, and then you get your PhD on this little tiny topic that you push the boundary of knowledge a little bit further. It's important because how knowledge works. But this may be one of the main lessons of your postgraduate studies. Here in Oxford, there's a very famous scientist and theologian, Alistair McGrath, who has a PhD in biophysics and then has gone on to a very distinguished career in theology. It's written, I think, 50 books or something. And one of the things that he has said to us is that, it took him many, many decades of thinking about things before he felt like he had something to say on them that was worth saying. And so one of the things that you learn from the academic world, probably the most important lesson, is that it's hard to obtain reliable knowledge and that it needs a community of people to do so. Now, how does your faith link to the topic that you're working on? This is the next thing I want to discuss. And people sometimes think, and Christians in certain traditions very definitely think this, that faith and knowledge are somehow different things. Like non-Christians often think this. They say faith is somehow linked to feelings and academic knowledge is, facts, and these are separated from each other in some kind of way. They're non-overlapping magisteria, they're completely different things. And of course, say science and our Christian faith are definitely different things, but I'd say they're much more like cousinly disciplines than opposites. And another way of thinking about them is to say, well, faith and knowledge have some overlap. So there are bits of our academic knowledge that are relevant to our faith and bits of our faith that are relevant to our academic knowledge. This is true. So, for example, historically, particular Christian ideas about a world that was made by an intelligent creator would therefore be intelligible. A good creator would therefore perhaps be a world that is reliable and repeatable. Those kinds of ideas played a really important role in the birth of modern science. So Christian faith has had a point in helping to birth academic knowledge. But I still think this picture is incomplete. I think a much better picture is to say that my faith is a much larger, all-encompassing way that I see the world. It tells me a lot about the way the world is. It tells me about things that are true and things that are important. It tells me about moral issues and a wide range of things, about the absolute things of the world. And academic knowledge is a circle within there. It's a very important circle within there, but it is within this bigger picture of faith. I think this is a much healthier and better way of thinking about the knowledge that we're trying to reach. And of course, we don't have all the academic knowledge at our fingertips, and our DPhil, MPhil, PhD may be a little tiny bit of that. But it's important to remember that it's part of a much bigger circle, much broader set of ideas, which is our Christian faith, which is not just it's not just an emotive thing, but it's also a cognitive thing. It's a mixture of all these things. It's a spiritual thing. Now, something that may be true for you is that if you spend a lot of time thinking, you might feel like you can integrate, how to put that kind of knowledge into the bigger circle of faith. But probably for most of our lives, the question of how the subject fits into there is a more difficult question. And very often it will feel a bit more like there are bits of your discipline that you can't quite match with your faith. And that's normal and healthy and good. And I can tell you many stories of things that previous generations of scientists, for example, found very difficult to connect up with their faith or merge with their faith. And it took many decades or hundreds of years of work to properly understand a scientific topic well enough to be able to work out how it links to our faith, for example. And perhaps a very famous example would be Newton and the planets. So you may or may not have heard the story, but when Newton first came up with gravity, he of course explained the elliptical orbits of planets around the sun. But of course, once you've got gravity between the planet and the sun, you've also got gravity between the different planets. And so Newton realized that in his calculations, the orbits would eventually become unstable. Therefore, the planets would eventually be ejected from the solar system. So Newton actually proposed that perhaps God occasionally reforms the planets, and he sends a comet through to kind of realign them before they all shoot out. Now, his great adversary, Leibniz, pointed out to him that this is probably bad theology because it makes God a kind of a poking into the world every so often, doing things to fix an imperfect creation. And also Leibniz pointed out that God does not do things for wants of nature, but for wants of grace. So God works in our world in what we might call miracles, unusual ways, for redemptive purposes. So Newton never made a big push of that. But actually, the question about why the planets were stable troubled people for a long time. And you remember the very famous story of Pierre-Simon Laplace, the French mathematician who wrote this 5-volume Celestial Mechanics, which he presented to Napoleon. And perhaps apocryphally, the story is that Napoleon asked him, why is God not in this story? And Laplace actually thought he'd proven the stability of the planets. And so he made a boast, which was that I have no need for that hypothesis or that God hypothesis. This is often taken as a statement of his atheism. In fact, Laplace was a practicing Catholic. And he just thought he'd solve the problem without the need of a divine intervention. It's only really in relatively recent times, with the advent of our understanding of chaos theory and items of stability within chaos and our ability to do very long, accurate simulations, that we understand why our solar system is stable. So had Christians, had you been a Christian and worried about this, as Newton did, or then when Laplace came along, you might have gotten nervous about how it fit in. And it would have been only really under modern, hundreds of years later that we understand the system well enough to make any kind of judgment about whether God did or did not intervene in the system. I'm just pointing that out. These things can take a very long time. And the other thing to remember is that our world is imperfect, right? So St. Augustine, in his very famous book, The City of God, is asked at some point whether Christians should be adjudged. And if they are asked to be adjudged, should they do this? And he said, yes. But he said, if you're a judge, you have to remember it's an inherently tragic vocation. You are going to punish some innocent people and let some guilty people go. It's just inevitably going to happen, given the fallibility of the human mind and the flaws in the human will. But yes, he said, you're still obliged to be a judge if you are called upon to be one. And so what this tells us that we live, in an imperfect world. And so we have to remember this is the case. And sometimes we'll make decisions that are wrong. And that is just the way that our world is currently, in its current, before the eschaton. This is how it is. I think this is helpful to remember. If you, sometimes particularly scientists and engineers, I think because we like perfection, like things really neatly tied up, we sometimes have difficulty with the imperfections of the world and the uncertainties of our world. And it's helpful to remember this is just the way the world is. And although you may not know how to fit these things together, we know that one day we will be able to fit them all together. And the last thing is, when I say I'm going to speak about Christians in the academy, often what people most want to hear is questions about navigating the kind of academic maze. And there are personal challenges. Often people feel lonely in their academic work. There's often a lot of perfectionism. So perfectionism is helpful in the sciences and engineering, obviously, but it can become oppressive. There's a lot of anxiety in academic worlds, identity issues, very famously imposter syndrome. It's become quite well discussed in recent years, the idea that you are there, but you feel like you somehow don't deserve to be there. And this is remarkably common. There's a higher incidence of depression. A lot of students worry a lot about time management. They're stressed. They feel a lot of pressure from their supervisors to get things done, and they don't feel like there's enough hours in a day, et cetera, et cetera. And so you often say that, a lot of academics and students are like swans. They try to appear calm on the outside, but they're paddling like mad underneath. And I don't want to talk too much about these things. I think these are really important issues. There are also issues that are shared with a number of other professions outside of the academy. So high pressure professions, professional jobs in banking or law or et cetera can also have a lot of these same characteristics to them. And it's good to talk to people about them and think these through. But I'm not going to talk too much about these issues. Rather than talk about a set of wider issues like I've just done. And I want to talk a little bit about what it means to be a Christian and how the academy affects us as Christians as well. But the last thing I wanted to show is a little cartoon, partially because if you haven't seen these, so phdcomics.com by a writer called Jorge Chum, 100% worth viewing. He's a very brilliant commentator on the academic world, and he has this in cartoons. And so here's a little how you see yourself, complex human being with hopes, dreams, and aspirations, and how most professors see you, a brain on a stick. And they ask, so how's research? And we have to be careful as Christians that we don't get caught up into this kind of a world where our whole sense of who we are and identity gets tied up into our research. I remember as a graduate student, this was very much my case at some point. I realized that how I felt about myself had a lot to do with how my work was going. And of course, you can have long, sometimes, I think I spent a whole year working on something which just never panned out. And my supervisor was a very hands-off supervisor, and so he just let me flounder for more or less a year. At the end of the year, I realized I more or less wasted it. And it's also when I realized that I can't let my sense of myself depend on how my work is going, because sometimes it'll go well and sometimes it won't go so well. And so an important part of our Christian calling is to remember that we are and seen by God as fully human beings. The next part of this talk is going to be about a different set of ideas, what I call odium theologicum and other pitfalls. So odium theologicum, I'll explain that to you in a minute. And I'm going to talk mainly about three issues: pride, isolation, and compromise. So I have these words from a very lovely little tiny book by a great German theologian from quite a while back. It's an old classic called A Little Exercise for Young Theologians. And you can find it in various online booksellers. It's for relatively cheap. And Thielicke talks really about three pitfalls: pride, isolation, and compromise. His exercise for young theologians, but you can easily generalize this to young engineers or young scientists or young academics of any stripe. And the first is pride. And Thielicke quotes 1 Peter 5:5, "Young men, in the same way, be submissive to those who are older. All of you clothe yourself with humility towards one another, because God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble." And Thielicke points out that it is possible, and laymen have a very exact perception in regard to this, that academics or academia makes the young academic vain, and so kindles in him or her something like Gnostic pride. The chief reason for this is that in us men, truth and love are seldom combined. So I think pride is a very important issue in the academic world, and we're often driven to try to succeed and try to excel, and we might feel that we're better than other people because we have done that and other people haven't, and so this generates a sense of pride. And Thielicke points out that lay people, so ordinary people who can be very sensitive to this. And if you are in a church and you're in the academy, you'll probably often have been warned about pride because people are very sensitive to this. I put deep insecurity and terror down there because actually, interestingly, in the academic world, the pride and insecurity are often very closely linked. One of the fascinating things you'll see is that you can find people who are extremely famous, who nevertheless have deep insecurities. They act in a very proudful way, but they're very nervous about what certain people think about them. I, for example, have a colleague, not in Oxford, but at a different university in a different country, actually, extremely distinguished in our field, probably one of the best people that there is in the world. And he is also extremely arrogant, you might say. And has a very well developed sense of self-esteem, shall we say. And one day he has another colleague at his university, which I might call John, who's possibly even more distinguished, or as distinguished as this man is. And one day I asked him, what do you think about John? And he said, oh, John is a very arrogant man. And I thought, oh, that's something coming from you. So I said, okay, so why is that? He said, the other day I had to go and meet John. And so I went to his office, I knocked on his door, and you know what he said to me? I said, what? He said, David, could you just wait a few minutes while I finish this conversation with a student? And I thought, okay. He said, can you believe how arrogant that man is? And then I realized what had really going on is that David really wanted John's approval. And the fact that John had made him wait for a few minutes made David feel tremendously insecure. He therefore called John a very arrogant man. But fundamentally, his great pride and insecurity were very closely linked to each other. So this is an interesting kind of dynamic that you'll see a lot. And I think often lay people, it's good to listen to them. They got a good sense for this, and we have to be careful as Christians not to get caught up by pride. And that links also to a sense of perspective. So sometimes our perspective, our sense of ourselves, our pride is because we care a lot about this particular issue that we're working on, and we feel that other people who don't care about that are somehow less than us. And this is why sometimes it's good to take a step back and not just remember that you're a part of a big circle of a big group of people that are all trying to push on boundaries of knowledge in different ways. And odium theologicum, I put it in there because I think it's such a funny word, cool word. It's something that I picked up from Helmut, so bad smelling theology is what it kind of means. It's majoring in minors, always focusing on where you disagree, and cynicism as a kind of default stance. And so one of the things that the academy teaches us is that we're always very careful in looking for errors in papers or in people's work. So if I read a research paper, I'll start reading it, look at the abstract, look at the introduction. If I start seeing that the writer doesn't have a good grasp of literature, cites the wrong papers, or doesn't cite the right papers, or doesn't quite weigh them right, then I'll often stop reading. Because to be really honest, in my field, the vast majority of papers are not really worth reading. They do something, but it's usually not that interesting. So that's a good heuristic for saving time and not reading things that are going to waste your time. But it's a very bad heuristic for interacting with, say, a sermon. So if somebody gives a sermon and I hear them talk about something I know a lot about and they don't quite get it right, if I use this majoring in minors, this kind of way of focusing on disagreement or picking up things that are wrong and discounting it, I'll discount perhaps something that could be very important for me to learn. So in my church, my pastor may not be an expert in physics, but he can tell me a lot of things about Christian life that I absolutely need to hear, and I probably need to hear again and again, like do not be proud, for example, which is a lesson we all need to hear many times. And so I think a link to this is kind of a sense of cynicism as a default stance, so that you're taught to be cynical about other people's work. Well, I won't believe it until I see it, and let me see the evidence for it. Those are good kind of rules of thumb, perhaps in the academy, but they can be bad in daily life, and in relational life, and in our Christian lives. Another example that can sometimes put distance between us and our Christian friends is, or what the academy does is you teach you how to explore abstractions. So you might talk about things that really matter as if they don't, and that's a good way of talking about it. So let's say that you're interested in thinking about some political question or some very difficult medical ethical question. We're taught to talk about them in a dispassionate way. Well, that's a very much a way that we've been trained, and many people around us may not have been trained that way, say in our church communities, for example, and may find that hard and off-putting. And so it's important to learn how to keep that in mind when you talk about ideas all the time. And if you find that people don't respond well to you, it's not necessarily because they're dumb or stupid, but maybe because for them, talking about things as if they don't matter is not something that they have really learned. So the real question for us in the academy is, how can we have critical minds? So have minds that are very careful about the truth and don't just take nonsense and leave it, and don't take nonsense seriously, but at the same time not have critical spirits, not use that as a way of separating us from others. Because what pride often does in Christian academics is it leads to some kind of isolation, a separation from the body of Christ. And that's very bad, because it often is the beginning of a series of steps that leads to us ending up in a place where we're no longer really fruitful for the kingdom of God. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of what it means to be a Christian in the academy, because another thing to think about is there are skills that we learn in the academy that can be super helpful for the church. And I sometimes think of Christian academics as kind of dual missionaries. So we're missionary, one of our callings is to be missionaries to the people in our labs, in our environment, that only we perhaps ever can reach. But we also have a duty sometimes to our Christian communities to help them think about, say, idolatries that they may face. So there are very strong, big strongholds in our culture, strongholds of materialism. It's rampant in the church as well. Racism, prejudice, all kinds of things that people just pick up from the environment around them and often import right into the church. So the church, they will behave just like they behave in the world around them, because they haven't really brought that bit of their lives fully under the control of God. And sometimes what our academic training can help us do is help unmask the idolatry, help show people that some of the ways that they behave may not be, maybe just purely impacted by the culture. And these idols, there's many of these idols. And if you look at materialism, for example, the Bible is full of big warnings. To Luke 12, I have here, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life is not consistent in the abundance of possessions. Well, this is something the Bible says in many places, but if you look at Christians, sometimes they do think that this is where life comes from. And I think it helps, as an academic, you can sometimes study how this works in society and therefore help Christians see that they're influenced by the society around them in ways that they didn't realize. Now, also linked to this, I think, is a true issue, which is that the churches, and particularly the evangelical church's interaction with scholarship has not always been as good as it could be. There's a book that I highly recommend called The Scandal of Evangelical Mind by a Christian historian called Mark Knoll, where he explains some of these patterns in more detail. And I'm sure that these patterns hold not just in the US, where he wrote it for, but also in Hong Kong. They definitely hold in Europe, and in slightly different ways, but the principles are the same. And so the church and scholarship is a complex relationship, and oftentimes the church has got it wrong or has undervalued scholarship greatly to its own detriment. And one of the detriments is that it's therefore got itself sucked into all kinds of idols of our age in ways that have been deeply destructive and unhelpful, either by following certain political ideas and buying them hook, line, and sinker without thinking about whether they are actually Christian or not. It would be a good example of that. Then what pride in these things can do, they can lead to isolation. And this is extremely dangerous. It says in Hebrews, do not quit meeting together, as some of you are in the habit of doing. Instead, encourage one another even more, since you see the day coming closer. And so what we can get is an isolation if we're not careful from the body of Christ, because we don't really feel that we fit there anymore, because our academic world is alienating us a little bit from the body of Christ that we are put into. And so it's really important that you are part of a local Christian spiritual community, that you're embedded in there, that there are people there who know you, that know your life well enough to speak into it. It's also actually important that you, as a Christian scholar, that you link up to a global intellectual community. There are Christians in each of your fields all over the world who've been thinking about this often for a long time. Christians also in the past, in previous generations, who've thought and written about these issues. It's important to engage with those and think, and not just think about things completely on your own, or just not think about things at all. So we have to grow our hearts as well as our minds together. So there's pride, isolation, and in fact, these are pride and isolation are two things that are dangerous for us. In fact, we need a community of scholars. I don't know if you're familiar with this great scholar, W.H. Pooh, but he says, when you are a bear of very little brain and you think of things, you find sometimes that a thing which seemed very thingish inside you is quite different when it gets out into the open and has other people looking at it. And this is actually interesting because it's a link to how we do academic research. So one of the things that you do is you work on your project and you write it up and send it off for peer review so others can look at it. Because sometimes something which seems very thingish inside you is not quite so thingish when it goes to peer review and other people find faults in your work. And in fact, P.J. Harrison, who's one of the great historians of science, has a series of books that explore some of these ideas. And one of the points he makes in these books is that the birth of modern science was heavily affected by the Reformation and a kind of re-understanding of the doctrine of our sinfulness and the noetic effects of sin, the way that sin affects our mental capacities. And so what you see is people like Robert Boyle, who's a local Oxford hero, father of modern chemistry, points out that doing science is not just something you do on your own, sitting on an armchair thinking about it. You need to do observation. This has to be communal, and you come to conditional conclusions. And this is because we believe that our faculties are fallen. So this idea that we need to work on things together in communities, that we have peer review, is a deeply Christian idea linked to an understanding of our fallenness. And again, so this is another reason why we need this communities of scholarship, and also we need to link up the communities of faith. So pride and isolation, if they keep working out in our lives, can lead to various kinds of compromise. And there's many kinds of compromise you can think of. There's a kind of, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's not usually, I think, the main kind of compromise that trips up young Christian scholars, young Christian PhD students and postdocs and etc., and young academics, or even older academics. I think one of the things that really trips us up is a kind of warping of epistemology, which is a fancy word for how we obtain knowledge, into ontology, into something which is what the world is really like. So one of the things that we do in science is we have a kind of methods which don't assume any kind of divine intervention. In fact, there are good theological reasons for that. I've written about that briefly in some essays on, if you type the name Ard Louis Miracles, you'll see one or two essays I've written on this topic. And so we think that God works in ordinary ways in our sciences, and that's what we're studying. And so you spend all your time thinking about very kind of mechanistic ways that the world works. If we're not careful, that way of understanding the world, that epistemological way of obtaining knowledge about the world, can warp into a sense that this is all the world is. The world is only made up of things that can be explained in this particular way. Well, that's not really, actually a very good and philosophically valid conclusion, but it's emotionally a very easy step to make if you're spending all your time thinking only one way about the world. And so you can slide into that kind of compromise. And so we have these other kind of underlying presuppositions in our academy that we're somehow have to be unbiased when we look at the world. And the unbiased often means a very kind of materialistic, naturalistic way of looking at the world. And if we're not careful, this kind of stance can affect how we think about ourselves and even about our faith, and so slowly erode it and corrode it. Now, there are, I think, actually for Christians, the sciences are easier than some of the humanities or social sciences, where there are stronger corrosive ideas underlying and often unquestioned ideas that are there. And so the idea of kind of doubt as a universe, kind of a universal doubting everything, can be also a universal solvent of all of your ideas, and that can be corrosive to your Christian thought. And a very great philosopher, one of the greatest philosophers of the last 50 years, Alvin Plantinga, wrote, first, it isn't actually more than 50 years. First, it isn't just in philosophy that we Christians are heavily influenced by the practice and procedures of our non-Christian peers. The same holds for nearly every important contemporary intellectual discipline. We imbibe these assumptions, if not with our mother's milk, at any rate, in learning to pursue our disciplines. What Plantinga is saying is, part of your training as an academic researcher is a kind of apprenticeship into a way of thinking about the world. And that's important because that's how you learn to kind of really judge how to obtain reliable knowledge in your field. But you have to be careful. Remember, that is one way of thinking about the world that can be very successful, but it's not the only way of thinking about the world. there are other multiple lenses that we need to keep in our arsenal when we look at the world and understand the world. And it's very important that this kind of methodological naturalism doesn't become what we think the real way the world is like. And I personally think that one of the biggest stumbling blocks for scientists to become Christians is in fact this kind of a warping of the methods that they use into an idea that this is really the way that the world works. That's not really a good extrapolation from something very local and quite limited to these big questions about who are we and how should we live. But it's kind of a natural thing for people to do. And so I call this warping of epistemology, how we obtain knowledge, into ontology, what the world is really like. And unraveling those things is really important if you want to have a true good conversation about the really big questions of life, including questions about ultimate things, including our faith. And there's other aspects of compromise that I think are perhaps a bit easier to see sometimes, but are equally pernicious. So our self-image. So one of the interesting things you'll see with students as they, particularly good students, when they get caught up in a discipline, they'll start thinking about themselves as you know, I'm a chemist, or I'm a physicist, or I'm a theoretical physicist, or I'm an experimental physicist, or I'm an anthropologist or something. And you start getting your sense of who you are gets linked up to your work. One of the things you'll see that academics among themselves talk a lot about who is smart, by the way, who's good at this field, who's really making the important steps. There are all these kind of very subtle internal academic hierarchies between people. So a story I told you about my friend David, it's a pseudonym, but he clearly, you know, the sense of hierarchy and self-image and identity and his insecurity and his pride were all closely linked to each other. And so these kinds of questions about self-image and identity are very, they can easily do a kind of compromise where we start worrying more about what our colleagues think about us than what, say, our brothers and sisters in Christ think about us. And once you get to that tipping point, it's often a one-way direction towards compromise. So I think what we have to remember is that as Christians, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for men, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is Lord Christ you are serving. So I have to often remind myself of this verse, that I'm doing this work to serve God and to please God, not to serve the people around me. That can often be freeing as well. So one of the interesting things I learned as a young postdoc was how much pressure there is on us to work on things that are hot. Right? So I have a lot of colleagues starting to well, I'm working on this topic because it's getting lots of papers in physical review letters or Nature or whatever the journal is that you really care about. And at some point, I remember hearing those things and something felt very wrong about it. And I remember thinking one day, what should I work on next in my career? What next projects should I start taking on? And I thought about my colleagues, some of them very distinguished colleagues who were so focused on what was hot and what was getting, lots of accolades. And I thought one day I'll stand before God and I'll have to give an account for what I've done. And saying, well, I chose these topics because they were the hot topics, which lots of people got lots of accolades, it just felt extremely wrong. And so I actually made a conscious choice at the time to work on some topics that were not so hot at the time and not so in vogue. Ended up being, I think I was blessed in those decisions. Those projects ended up working really well. People thought they were very strange at the time. Why was I doing that? And in the end, they ended up getting me a position in Oxford because they were successful. I'm not saying that that's how it'll always work for you, but I'm just saying for me, I needed to think about why I was doing and who I was doing this work for in order to have to be brave enough to go on an academic journey that was a bit unconventional or not the hot thing at the time. And I've got colleagues who do that, who are not Christians, who do that completely on their own, but I needed my Christian faith to think that through. So what are the next steps for you? Lots of next steps you can think about. One I think is important is to look for Christian community, both Christian community that you can really be part of, that can look at your heart and your soul, not just your mind, as it were. But also look for a scholarly community. Think about how your faith and your studies work together. You're obviously here at the conference to do that, but this is just a small step on what is hopefully a lifetime of thinking about these things. And you need to work at these, at this. You need to work not only at the knowledge that you're trying to gain, but also at the virtues that come, that you need to steward them well. And also take a long view. Many came before you and many will come after you. And so you're just here to do God's will at this time, at this small place. And if there's questions you can answer, you can try to make a little chip and make them a little bit better formulated and move on. And this is, I think, also a very helpful perspective to have on who we are and where we're going and where we come from. I've got another website here in Oxford that I think some of you might find interesting. It's called Oxford Conversations, where we have a number of very interesting thinkers that we interview and ask about some of their science, about their faith. So here's Andy Gosler, who's an evolutionary biologist, a bird expert, who actually came to faith in his 40s after having read Richard Dawkins' books and just wondering, why is Dawkins so angry? What is he so angry about? Let me read the other side. And he came to faith. And there's a few other experts here. There are scientists well worth listening to and listening to how they, as very successful scientists, have married their faith and their work together. And I think they're hopefully in this conference you'll also meet other local people that you can engage with in this way. But it's very important to have these kinds of mentors, people that you can interact with. So finally, in conclusion, I talked about academic pursuits as a godly vocation. I told you that obtaining academic new knowledge is really hard, and that you could do it for many reasons, including to serve humanity in the world, to seek the welfare of the city, to praise God with your minds. Some of your work may also help the church to unmask, and the world to unmask idolatries, that there are things that are not right in our world. I talked about odium theologicum and other pitfalls, so pride, being superior, majoring in minors, isolation from the body of Christ, the importance of local and global intellectual community. And then lastly, I spoke about the dangers of compromise, imbibing cultural assumptions from our disciplines and exporting them into the rest of our lives, and how that might bring us a tipping point sometimes where we start drifting away from our faith because we care more about these academic community that we're in than we care about God and His eternal world and about what our Christian brothers and sisters know about us. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to speaking to you next week and answering any questions you might have. Thank you.